Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's question of doom is one which I get the impression that the questioner had a little bit of trouble sort of crystallizing their idea and their thought. So the question is as follows. Hey Mr. Soup, is stuff always getting older? This might sound like a strange question, but will the Neolithic always be the Neolithic? Will it always be around 7,000 years ago? I don't know if I'm getting my point across properly. We're always moving forwards in time. Is the past also moving forward in time? This probably sounds like a really dumb question, but I was talking with a friend at a party and we couldn't decide. What do you think? Max Imus DM, possibly a reference to Maximus Decimus Meridius, or maybe Max is just an amazing dungeon master. Dungeons and Dragons reference for the win. Now, actually, Max, you ask a really interesting question. I know to the casual observer, indeed to yourself, it might sound like it's a potentially really stupid question because the answer is obvious. But actually, that's not necessarily the case. Now, let's start with the central premise, the question about time and how it relates to where we are, the present, as it were. Well, most people view time as a timeline, especially, for example, in schools or in history textbooks. It's got a beginning and a middle and an end. And the end is always moving forwards, it's always being added to, and the beginning and the middle are always essentially in a sort of stasis. They never change. They're back there. They have happened. They're just they're somewhere behind us. They're never going to be different because nothing is happening in the past. That's certainly the conventional way of looking at time, and actually the present is always moving into the future, ever onwards into this future which we have imagined. Now, and that's the key point. Actually, we imagine that the future exists, but the future doesn't exist. It hasn't happened yet. Therefore, it's not here. It doesn't. There's no way to think about the future until it has in fact already occurred. So in some ways, actually, and in fact this actually pans out in philosophy and in physics, it's actually more helpful to think of time as being, or certainly the present, as being a viewpoint, being a moment where you look backwards upon what has happened before you. And in that sense, if the present is always a viewpoint, no matter when it is occurring, the past is always moving backwards away from it. So actually time, and certainly past time, the past, is always moving away from us. It's always going backwards away. Now that might sound like semantics, but actually it does sort of play out in terms of, as I said, the philosophy, in terms of the fact that the future hasn't happened yet and doesn't exist, but also actually the physics. There's a concept in physics of a light cone, where if you imagine that all visible light from every star, every galaxy in the universe, comes to a single moment when you are viewing it, if you could view it all at the same time, and then passes through that moment and continues onwards. In fact, these cones meet at the present, but they expand back into the past and actually out into the future. A light cone is a sort of a physical representation of time and space from the perspective of the present, from the perspective of a viewer, and it sort of underlines this concept. Actually, the past can be viewed as something which is in fact expanding away from us, expanding in part because obviously we're adding to it all the time with our knowledge through archaeology and history research, but also actually expanding away from us because it is part of this light cone. It is a construct which demonstrably is no longer part of the present and no longer part of the observable moment. So your question actually has some real merit to it. So don't dismiss it as stupid. It's actually a very, very interesting question. Now, that's the underpinning, the theoretical underpinning for this concept being valid. But also you've got to remember that actually also concepts of the past, not just the fact that the past is in fact possibly moving away from us, but concepts of the past are always changing as well. As we've said before on this YouTube channel, but also as a friend of mine on the Archaeologist podcast has said previously, the past is always created in the present for the future. Now that's a slightly bizarre way of saying it, but essentially what we're saying is that people now are always imagining the past when we talk about it. We're always creating something which actually is a narrative, it's a story. And this story has the capacity to change, it's not static. So for example, last night Mrs. Soup mentioned, we were going to sleep basically, and she said, that question of doom, and she talked about how it related to, say, the concept of the Dark Ages. The fact that at one point it was very fashionable to talk about the post-Roman world, in particular in Britain, as a cultural dark age, when we forgot everything. We became knuckle-dragging simpletons, apparently. But that's simply not the case. We know that's not the case through research, and over time, through the narratives which have come out of literature, metalworking, language, art, carving, clothing, so on and so forth, international contacts. We now know actually that the Dark Ages are not dark, were not dark. So actually also the concept of these times not only are subject to change, these eons are subject to change, but also they're always being viewed once again from that present moment, which again brings us back to this idea that somehow the present is fixed. It is always at a different point on the timeline, but it's always actually quite fixed. Now this is actually a really useful concept when thinking about, for example, artifacts. Now artifacts may well be from a certain point on the timeline, a certain point out there in the cone, as it were, but they are here with us in the present, and in that sense, in a very literal way, every day they get older. Every day, for example, a sword from the Iron Age is aging. It is getting bit by bit older. This has implications for studying the artifact. It has implications for conserving the artifact, but it also should have implications for the way that we think about the artifact. It's not just from the Iron Age. It is in fact with us now. And this means that actually it's in some ways existing in two different ways. It is existing as a current, present, modern artifact, but it's also existing as an Iron Age relic, which is whose origins are always moving away from us in the timeline. So it is present with us from that viewpoint, but it's always going backwards. Now, these ideas, these concepts, they're all very theoretical. They're all very there's very much a thought exercise that we've been playing here. This idea that somehow the past is the thing which is moving and we're staying still. People use this sort of terminology when they're trying to comprehend travelling through wormholes or trying to discuss time travel, all this kind of thing. Maybe the idea is to think about us as not being the thing that we think we are, this kind of thing. So in some ways it sounds like science fiction, fashionable babble. But actually I firmly believe that it's a really helpful way to turn some of these assumptions about the past on its head. Because we do tend to think in a very dogmatic, dare I say, way, especially about timelines, and especially, for example, about, say, the Romans, or about the Stone Ages, or whatever, and that somehow that stuff is done and fixed and is stagnant. But I think it's a really helpful, really helpful exercise to actually remind yourself that this stuff is moving away from us. It's always being added to with archaeological discoveries, but also as well it has the potential to still exist in the present. These moments, these artifacts, these sites of significance are with us still. And the relationships that come out of that thought process can be extremely helpful and useful for thinking about how to deal with archaeology. So once again, the question is valid. The question is actually much deeper than many historians, archaeologists, ever really go when they think about the past. So you've asked an excellent question, Max, and hopefully this has sort of gone some way to helping to answer your question, in so much as I don't think there is a definite answer, because time can be viewed from both perspectives. It's both fixed in the past, but also it is moving. It is us who are ever looking backwards from a fixed point just before the future occurs. Now, actually, finally, there is something that I'd like to add to that, and that is that there is a point in time, or rather there is an era in time which will definitely change. You could argue that the Neolithic will in fact always be the Neolithic, even if it is getting further away from us in time. That is true. That is absolutely true, unless we change the way that we talk or the way that we classify different periods of time. But there is one period of time which is definitely going to change. Do you want to have a guess what that is? Drum roll, please. It is, in fact, the Middle Ages. Because eventually they won't be in the middle, will they? The medieval period, the Middle Ages, are what separates modernity, so-called, from the classical world. They are in the middle between modern Europe, usually, and classical Europe, usually. That's sort of how the Middle Ages came about. And indeed, how they viewed themselves. They viewed themselves as a very much connected to the classical world in terms of philosophy and some of the legacies, people like Charlemagne. And we, in turn, in the 1800s, for example, very much viewed them as a bridge to that classical world. So the Middle Ages have been for a long time in the middle, and indeed for a long time they will be in the middle. But eventually they won't be in the middle, because there'll be a lot more of what is next filling in the gap, and they'll be sort of like 2/3 of the way along a timeline, and they'll be like, well, that's no longer the Middle Ages, is it? That's more like the 2/3 back ages, and so on and so forth. So that's a very, very simple but a very real example where actually our terminology may be at fault, but nonetheless it does bring up the very real fact that the past is in fact not stagnant. The past is always subject to change, and these changes are often, yes, dictated by how we talk about the past in the present, but also as well they're dictated by the fact that actually the past is defined in many ways, many definitions, moving away from us, and therefore eventually the middle won't be the middle. So once again, thank you so much for asking the question, Max. It's been a pleasure to think about this one, and a genuine pleasure to try and validate your question. So much as at first it sounded very much as though you were going, no, I'm so stupid. Or more to the point, I'm having so much trouble actually talking about this. And it's been a real pleasure trying to get at what you were talking about, and hopefully this has helped you to clarify your thoughts and to come to some conclusions of your own. Anyone else out there who's watching this, please do feel free to comment below. We would love to see your comments. I would certainly, I'm sure Max would as well, and yeah, I really look forward to seeing what comes out of this particular conversation on this video, because it's not, strictly speaking, an archaeological question, but it's definitely it's like a meaty theoretical question when it comes to how we think about archaeology, and I look forward to seeing what you guys think. Nonetheless, with that in mind, and with the fact that this video is in the past and will be ever moving backwards away from the present viewer, let's hope that in the present, whenever you are viewing this video, that you are indeed looking after yourself. And as I say, as ever, until next time, please do take care. Bye bye.